Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. The Greyhound bus rattled every time the tires hit a cracked stretch of pavement on I-94. I was sitting by the window in the back row, wearing headphones that weren't actually playing anything. Honestly, I just didn't want anyone trying to start a conversation. The seat next to me was empty. I was glad about that. For nearly 6 months leading up to that point, my life had revolved around long bus rides. I lost my job at a logistics warehouse outside Minneapolis during a round of layoffs. At first, I figured I'd find something else pretty quickly. I had experience, a decent work history, no criminal record, no major issues. Turns out, a lot of other people thought the same thing. I'd sent out a little over 10 applications, interviewed in Duluth, then Rochester, then St. Cloud. One time, I spent nearly 4 hours traveling just to hear a hiring manager tell me they'd decided to move forward with another candidate. Every time it happened, I'd get back on a bus, ride home to my tiny apartment, open my laptop, and start searching for the next opportunity. By then, my savings were almost gone. I opened my wallet, one $20 bill, 3 crumpled singles, a credit card that was getting dangerously close to its limit. That was everything I had left. Rent was due in less than 2 weeks. My landlord had already sent me 2 reminder emails that month. I hadn't worked up the nerve to answer either of them. Up near the front of the bus, the driver had a local radio station playing. An old country song drifted through the cabin, almost completely drowned out by the sound of the engine. Outside the window, endless fields stretched beneath the gray Minnesota sky. I remember staring out there for a long time, thinking about something that anyone who's ever been unemployed will probably understand. If I don't find a job this month, where am I supposed to go? At the time, I had no idea that a phone call was about to change my life completely. All I knew was that I was in a position where almost any job offer would have been hard to turn down. The call came about 40 minutes later, somewhere between St. Cloud and Minneapolis. I almost let it go to voicemail. The number wasn't saved, and over the previous few months, most unexpected calls had either been telemarketers, debt collectors, or recruiters who sounded interested until they actually looked at my resume. For some reason, I answered anyway. Maybe because I was tired of bad news and figured one more piece of it couldn't make things much worse. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Sharon Gilbert. Her voice sounded calm, older, the kind of voice you hear in small-town diners and church fundraisers. She asked if I was John Boyd. I told her I was. There was a brief pause. Then she told me my father had passed away 3 weeks earlier. I remember staring out the bus window after she said it, watching gray farmland slide past while my brain tried to catch up. The truth is, my father and I hadn't spoken in years. There hadn't been some dramatic fight, no screaming match, no disowning. We had simply drifted apart the way people sometimes do when they live far away and neither side makes enough effort. At first it was missed calls, then Christmas cards, then eventually nothing. Hearing he was dead felt strange, but not in the way people might expect. Mostly it felt unreal. Then Sharon told me something that got my full attention. My father had left me everything he owned, including a lakeside resort in northern Minnesota. I honestly thought it was some kind of scam. I almost hung up. But she knew too much. She knew details about my father that weren't public. She knew details about me that I hadn't put online anywhere. By the time the call ended, she'd convinced me to come take a look at the property before making any decisions. 2 days later, I rented the cheapest pickup truck I could find and drove north. The farther I got from Minneapolis, the fewer cars I saw. Gas stations became less frequent. Cell service started dropping in and out. The roads narrowed, the forests thickened, and eventually I found myself following a county road that seemed determined to disappear into the woods. When I finally saw the sign for Lake Serenity Resort, it looked older than I expected. The paint was faded. One corner leaned slightly. The place itself sat beside a large lake surrounded by pine trees that stretched in every direction. There was a main lodge, 6 guest cabins, a maintenance shed, a boathouse, and a long dock reaching into the water. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't some luxury resort. It looked like the kind of place families rented during fishing season, because their parents had rented it years earlier. Sharon met me in front of the lodge. She was probably in her late 60s, wearing work boots and a faded twins jacket. We shook hands. She offered condolences. I thanked her. Then we got straight to business. Over the next hour, she showed me everything: utility panels, storage closets, water pumps, reservation logs, insurance paperwork. It felt less like inheriting property and more like being handed responsibility for something that had been running long before I arrived. The strange part was that the resort wasn't failing. It wasn't making anyone rich, but it was surviving. Occupancy rates were decent. Maintenance costs were manageable. If I could keep it running through summer, it might actually solve most of my financial problems. That realization hit me harder than I expected. For the first time in months, I could see a future that didn't involve overdue rent notices and rejected job applications. Near sunset, Sharon handed me a folder. Most of it contained paperwork, property records, vendor contacts, local permits. Tucked inside was a single folded sheet of paper. I opened it and found 5 rules written in my father's handwriting. The first one said to spread salt around every doorway before dark. The second said all guests had to leave before 5 p.m. on checkout day. The third said the dock gate must be locked at sunset. The fourth said not to answer any door after midnight. The fifth mentioned staying indoors if the lake ever reflected something that wasn't really there. I remember looking up and waiting for Sharon to laugh. She didn't. She simply took a sip of coffee and told me my father had followed those rules for more than 20 years. That was all she said. No explanation, no story, no context. Honestly, I figured it was some local tradition, maybe a superstition. Small towns always seem to have a few. That night I stayed in the lodge office. I ordered pizza from a place 40 minutes away, spent most of the evening going through reservation records, and fell asleep in a chair around midnight. The next few days were busy enough that I barely thought about the list. I cleaned cabins, fixed loose railings, learned the reservation software, met returning guests. Most of them remembered my father. They all described him differently, but a few details kept repeating. Stubborn, reliable, quiet. One thing that surprised me was how many people asked whether I was following the routine. Nobody explained what that meant. They just asked casually while checking in or unloading fishing gear. One older man named Carl asked if I had enough salt. I thought he was joking. He wasn't smiling. A woman renting cabin 4 asked whether I locked the dock gate every evening. Another guest asked whether Sharon had given me my father's notes. Every conversation ended before I could get any real answers. It was like everyone assumed I already knew something I didn't. About a week after arriving, I found 3 unopened bags of rock salt in the maintenance shed. I stood there staring at them for a minute. Then I loaded them into a wheelbarrow and spent 20 minutes walking around the property, sprinkling thin lines across each doorway. Not because I believed the rule, mostly because it seemed easier than arguing with half the town. The sun was setting by the time I finished. The lake had turned dark blue beneath a cloudy sky. The air smelled like rain. I walked down to the dock. The gate stood open. Rule 3 drifted back into my mind. Lock the dock gate at sunset. I rolled my eyes, closed it, and slid the latch into place. The metal clicked. The sound echoed farther across the water than it should have. I started walking back toward the lodge. Halfway there I heard something. A bell. Just one faint metallic ring from somewhere out on the lake. I stopped and listened. Nothing followed. No second ring. No boat engine. No voices. The lake returned to silence. I convinced myself it was probably a buoy or some fisherman packing up for the evening. Still, I found myself looking across the water longer than necessary. The feeling passed. The next morning brought rain. Steady, cold rain that lasted until mid-afternoon. I spent most of the day repairing shelves in the storage room. When the storm finally ended, I stepped outside and noticed something strange. Every salt line around the resort had washed away. I remembered the note saying they needed to be replaced after rain. Again, I didn't believe any of it. But for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I grabbed another bag and reeded every doorway before sunset. Maybe because I'd started getting used to the routine. Maybe because part of me wanted to understand why everyone took it so seriously. That evening, while locking up the office, I found myself looking out toward the lake again. The water was perfectly calm. Not a ripple, not a wave. Just a smooth sheet of dark glass stretching into the trees. For a second, I had the uncomfortable feeling that someone was standing at the far end of the dock. I blinked. The shape vanished. Probably a shadow. Probably exhaustion. I remember rubbing my eyes and laughing at myself. Then I turned off the office lights and headed upstairs. At the time, I still believed there was a logical explanation for everything. Looking back now, that was probably the last completely normal week I had at Lake Serenity Resort. I slept badly that night. Not because anything happened, at least not anything I could point to afterward, but because the image of that empty dock kept finding its way back into my head every time I started drifting off. The strange thing was that I couldn't even explain what had bothered me about it. I'd spent most of my life around lakes. Minnesota is full of them. Water at night wasn't exactly a new experience. Still, something about the way the lake looked after sunset stayed with me. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, made coffee in the lodge kitchen, and sat near the front window while fog rolled across the water. Everything looked normal again. Fishermen were already loading equipment into boats. A pair of guests from Cabin 2 were arguing about directions to a bait shop. Somewhere outside I could hear somebody dragging a cooler across gravel. Normal sounds. Real sounds. The kind of sounds that made me feel slightly ridiculous for being unsettled by a shadow the night before. Around 8 o'clock, Sharon stopped by carrying a cardboard tray with 2 coffees. She handed one to me without asking if I wanted it. That seemed to be her style. She sat across from me and asked how things were going. I told her everything was fine. Mostly because it was. Business was steady. The weather had improved. Nobody had complained about anything. She nodded and took a sip of coffee. Then her eyes drifted toward the lake. I noticed she did that a lot. Almost everybody around the resort seemed to do it. They'd be talking about something completely unrelated, then suddenly glance toward the water as if checking on something. I asked her why people around here seemed so interested in whether I followed my father's rules. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared into her coffee for a few seconds. Then she shrugged. She said my father had earned people's trust because he took the place seriously. I told her that wasn't really an answer. She admitted it wasn't. Then she stood up, wished me luck with the weekend reservations, and left. That was becoming another pattern. Every time I got close to asking something important, the conversation somehow ended. The weekend turned out to be the busiest one since I'd arrived. Families checked in throughout Friday afternoon. Kids ran between cabins. People hauled fishing gear, folding chairs, coolers, and enough snacks to survive a small apocalypse. By sunset, every cabin was occupied. The noise level around the resort increased dramatically. For the first time since inheriting the property, it actually felt alive. I spent most of Saturday solving ordinary problems. One cabin had a clogged sink. Another needed extra towels. Somebody locked themselves out. One guest accidentally dropped a phone off the dock and blamed me for not warning him how slippery the boards were. Nothing unusual. Honestly, it felt good. The more I worked, the less I thought about strange rules and mysterious warnings. Late Saturday afternoon, I noticed something odd, though not alarming. A family staying in Cabin 5 had packed their vehicle unusually early. Their checkout wasn't until Sunday. At first, I assumed they planned to spend the evening somewhere else. Around 4:30, However, they loaded their last bags into the SUV. The father walked into the office, handed me their cabin key, and said they were leaving. I asked whether something was wrong. He said no. I asked whether the cabin had any issues. Again, no. Then he glanced at the wall clock. 4:37. He thanked me for everything and left. Less than 10 minutes later, they were gone. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Then another guest checked out early. Then another. Not all of them, but enough that I noticed. Every person who left seemed strangely aware of the time. 4:43, 4:49, 4:52. One older couple practically jogged from their cabin carrying luggage. By 4:58, the parking lot had emptied considerably. I found myself remembering Rule 2. All guests must leave before 5 p.m. on checkout day. If someone remains on the property after that time, do not interact with them. Call the manager and stay indoors. I remember laughing quietly to myself. There had to be some practical explanation. Maybe my father had a strict policy. Maybe guests simply respected it. At exactly 5 o'clock, I locked the office and started walking toward the lodge. That's when I saw somebody standing near cabin 3. A man. At least I thought it was a man. He stood partially behind a tree facing the cabin. I couldn't see his face clearly. What struck me first was that I didn't recognize him. Every guest currently staying at the resort was accounted for. Everybody who should have left was gone. Yet there he was, just standing there. I raised a hand. No response. I called out. Still nothing. The distance wasn't far enough for him not to hear me. For a second I considered walking over. Then I remembered the rule again. Not because I believed it, more because it suddenly occurred to me how strange the situation actually was. Before I could decide what to do, a car door slammed somewhere behind me. I glanced away for maybe 2 seconds. When I looked back, the figure was gone. Completely gone. There wasn't enough time for him to reach the woods. There wasn't enough time for him to get into a vehicle. The area around cabin 3 sat completely empty. I stood there for a while trying to convince myself I'd simply mistaken a shadow or a tree trunk for a person. Eventually, I headed back toward the lodge. That evening, I locked the dock gate at sunset. Not because I believed Rule 3. Not entirely. It was becoming habit. That's all. At least that's what I told myself. The sky darkened gradually. Most remaining guests retreated indoors. Television light flickered behind cabin curtains. Somewhere across the property, somebody laughed. Then the sound faded. Night settled over the lake. Around 10 o'clock, I finished paperwork and walked outside to throw away a trash bag. The air felt cooler than expected. The lake stretched across the darkness like black glass. I was halfway back to the lodge when I heard it again. The bell. One clear metallic ring drifting across the water. I stopped immediately. There it was. The exact same sound I'd heard 2 nights earlier. Faint. Distant. Impossible to locate. A few seconds passed. Then another ring. This time I noticed something that made the hair on my arms rise. The sound wasn't moving. If it came from a boat, the boat wasn't traveling. If it came from a buoy, it should have been closer to shore than it sounded. The bell seemed to be hanging somewhere out in the darkness beyond the dock, fixed in place. Ring. Silence. Ring. Silence. I took a few steps toward the shoreline before catching myself. Rule 3 surfaced in my mind again. If you hear a bell from the water, return to the lodge immediately. I stood there feeling mildly irritated with myself. I didn't like that the rule was influencing my decisions. I didn't like that it had even crossed my mind. But the truth is, I suddenly didn't feel like investigating anymore. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was being cautious. Either way, I turned around and went inside. The bell rang once more before I closed the door. That night I lay awake listening to the wind move through the trees. Sometime after midnight, I finally drifted off. Then I woke up. I don't know what time it was. The room was dark. For several seconds, I couldn't figure out why I was awake. Then I heard it. Knock. A single knock somewhere downstairs. I held my breath. Silence followed. A minute passed, maybe two. Then another knock. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the front door of the lodge. I sat upright in bed. Every logical explanation immediately entered my head. A guest needed help. Somebody locked themselves out. Maybe Sharon stopped by unexpectedly. Then another memory surfaced. Do not open the door after midnight. No matter who it is. I stared toward the darkness of the room. Listening. Another knock echoed through the lodge below. Slow. Patient. As if whoever stood outside knew I was awake. I stayed perfectly still in bed, listening. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it. That strange half-awake state where dreams bleed into reality for a few seconds before your brain catches up. Then the knock came again. Slow. Deliberate. 3 taps against the front door downstairs. I checked my phone. 1217 amperes. The screen's glow briefly lit the room before fading again. For a moment I considered all the reasonable explanations. A guest locked out of their cabin. Somebody with a plumbing problem. A family emergency. The resort sat far enough from town that people occasionally needed help after hours. I swung my legs off the bed and sat there rubbing my eyes. Another knock echoed through the building. Whoever was outside wasn't pounding on the door. They weren't impatient. If anything, they sounded calm. Patient. Like they knew I would eventually answer. I stood up and slipped on my boots. Halfway to the bedroom door, I remembered the 4th rule. Do not open the door for anyone after midnight. It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter if you recognize them. I actually laughed under my breath. Not because I found it funny. More because I hated that I was thinking about it at all. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Then another knock came from downstairs and I froze again. Something about the sound bothered me. Most people knock differently when they need help. There's urgency. Frustration. Maybe embarrassment. This sounded almost rehearsed. Tap. 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 Then silence. I walked into the hallway and moved toward the staircase. The lodge creaked softly beneath my weight. Every old building has its own sounds at night. Pipes settling. Wood expanding and contracting. Wind pushing against loose siding. I'd spent enough nights there by then to recognize most of them. This wasn't one of those sounds. I reached the bottom floor and stopped beside the office. The front door stood about 20 feet away. Moonlight filtered through the glass panels beside it. Another knock. Closer now. I could practically feel it through the walls. Then a voice spoke from outside. A man's voice. Calm. Friendly. He sounded older. Maybe late 50s. Maybe 60s. Hard to tell. He said he was sorry for bothering me so late. He said he was having car trouble. He asked if I could help him make a phone call. I stood there listening. Everything about it sounded normal. That's what made it unsettling. There was no panic in his voice. No irritation. No signs he was stranded. Just patience. I walked a little closer. Not all the way to the door. Maybe halfway. The voice spoke again. This time he used my name. He asked if I was John. I remember stopping immediately. The guests knew my name. The regulars knew my name. Plenty of people around the area knew who I was by then. Still, hearing it through the door after midnight made my stomach tighten slightly. I asked who he was. There was a pause. Then he gave a name I didn't recognize. He said he'd spoken with my father years ago. He said Sharon would know him. He sounded completely believable. Another knock followed. Not louder. Not more aggressive. Just persistent. I found myself looking toward the lock. I was already mentally justifying opening it. Crack the door. Keep the chain on. Ask a few questions. Nothing wrong with that. Then I remembered another part of the rule. It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter if you recognize them. Suddenly the wording felt oddly specific. Not don't answer strangers. Not be careful. It doesn't matter what they say. almost like whoever wrote it expected the person outside to sound convincing. I backed away from the door. The voice continued speaking, not constantly, just every minute or so, asking for help, mentioning the cold, mentioning his vehicle. The strange thing was that he never sounded frustrated. Most people would eventually get annoyed. He didn't. He sounded exactly the same every time. Calm, friendly, patient. I looked at my phone again. 12:24. 7 minutes had passed. The knocking continued. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. Somewhere in the distance, wind moved through the trees. The lake sat invisible beyond the darkness outside. I considered calling Sharon. Then I felt stupid for even thinking about it. What exactly was I supposed to say? There's a polite man outside asking for help, and I'm scared because of a note my dead father left behind. I rubbed my face and paced the office. 8 minutes. 9. The knocking never changed. When my phone showed 12:28, I remembered the last part of the rule. If the knocking continues for more than 10 minutes, turn on every light and avoid looking out the windows. I almost ignored it. Then I realized the knocking had already been happening for nearly 11 minutes. My chest tightened slightly, not fear exactly. More irritation mixed with curiosity. Still, I walked through the lodge, turning on lights. The office, the kitchen, the hallway, the dining area. One by one, the rooms brightened. The voice outside stopped speaking. The knocking stopped too. The sudden silence felt heavier than the sound itself. I stood there listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No vehicle starting. No door opening. Nothing at all. Eventually, I went upstairs. I didn't sleep much after that. Every small sound made me check the time. Every creak made me sit up. Morning couldn't arrive fast enough. When sunlight finally spilled through the windows, I got dressed and headed outside. The first thing I did was check the front entrance. No footprints. No tire tracks. No evidence anyone had ever been there. That wasn't impossible. The ground was dry. Still, it bothered me. Around 10 o'clock, Sharon arrived. I tried to play the conversation casually at first. I asked whether anyone in the area drove an older pickup. She asked why. I told her about the visitor. The moment I mentioned the knocking, her expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough that I noticed. She became very quiet. I asked whether she knew the name the man had given me. She said no. Then she asked if I'd opened the door. I told her I hadn't. She nodded slowly. We stood there for several seconds. Finally, I asked what would have happened if I had. Sharon looked toward the lake before answering. That was another thing people around there did. Whenever they didn't want to talk directly, they'd look at the water first. Then she said she didn't know. I told her that wasn't reassuring. She said it wasn't supposed to be. Then she changed the subject. The rest of the day felt normal enough. Guests checked in. Kids played near the cabins. Boats moved across the lake. By evening, I almost convinced myself the previous night had been nothing more than a strange encounter with a confused traveler. Then the rain started. A slow, steady rain that continued through most of the night. Around midnight, I woke briefly to the sound of it hitting the roof. Then I fell asleep again. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately noticed something. Every line of salt around every doorway had vanished, washed away completely. For a few moments, I just stood there staring at the wet ground. Then I remembered Rule 1. If it rains, replace the salt immediately after the rain ends. I don't know why, but that rule suddenly felt more important than it had before. Maybe because of the knocking. Maybe because I was beginning to realize too many strange things around the resort seemed connected to those 5 rules. Whatever the reason, I walked to the maintenance shed, grabbed another bag of salt, and started making my way around the property. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared. The lake reflected pale sunlight. Everything looked peaceful. Ordinary. Yet as I finished the final doorway and straightened up, I noticed someone standing at the far end of the dock. A man, motionless, watching the water. My stomach tightened immediately. It was the same feeling I'd had near cabin 3. I blinked once, then twice. The figure remained there, too far away to identify, too still to be comfortable. I took a step forward. The figure slowly turned its head toward me. Then a bell rang somewhere out on the lake, one clear metallic note drifting across the water. When I looked back toward the dock, the man was gone. For a second, I honestly thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figure had been there. I was sure of it. One moment someone was standing at the far end of the dock. The next there was nothing except weathered boards stretching over dark water. The bell's sound lingered in the air for a few seconds before fading into silence. I stood motionless, staring across the lake, waiting for some obvious explanation to appear. Maybe the man had crouched down. Maybe he'd stepped behind one of the support posts. Maybe distance and fading light were doing strange things to my perception. I walked halfway toward the dock before stopping myself. Rule 3 came back immediately. If you hear the bell from the water, return to the lodge. I hated that those rules were beginning to influence my behavior. A month earlier, I would have laughed at the idea. Now I found myself standing there arguing with a dead man's handwritten note. Eventually, I turned around and headed back to the lodge. The whole walk back, I could feel an uncomfortable pressure between my shoulder blades. The sensation people describe when they think they're being watched. Every few steps, I had the urge to glance over my shoulder. I resisted until I reached the porch. When I finally looked back, the dock remained empty. That night, I stayed busy on purpose. I cleaned inventory shelves that didn't need cleaning. I reorganized reservation forms. I checked maintenance logs twice, anything to avoid thinking about the lake. Around 9 o'clock, a guest named Frank stopped by the office to buy firewood. Frank had been visiting the resort for years. Retired electrician, quiet guy, the kind of man who always seemed to know more than he said. While I loaded wood into his truck, he casually asked whether I'd heard the bell yet. I nearly dropped one of the bundles. He noticed my reaction immediately. I asked how he knew about it. Frank shrugged and leaned against the truck bed. Then he said everyone who stays there long enough hears it eventually. I asked what it was. He said he didn't know. I asked whether my father ever talked about it. Frank became quiet. For several seconds he looked toward the lake, just like Sharon always did. Then he said my father respected the rules, because he had learned what happened when people didn't. Before I could ask anything else, Frank thanked me for the firewood, climbed into his truck, and drove away. That conversation bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Not because it answered anything. Because it didn't. Everyone knew something. Nobody would explain it. The next morning, the resort felt normal again. Bright sunlight reflected off the water. Kids rode bicycles between cabins. Somebody grilled burgers near cabin 4. Life continued. Around noon, I received a reservation request from a family planning to stay 3 nights. Ordinary. By afternoon, I had almost convinced myself the previous evening hadn't mattered. Then the rain arrived. It started as a light drizzle and gradually turned into a steady downpour. By sunset, water ran off cabin roofs in sheets. I spent most of the evening inside the office listening to weather reports and responding to emails. The storm finally ended shortly after midnight. I didn't think much about it until the following morning. The moment I stepped outside, I realized every salt line on the property had disappeared. Again, Rule 1 immediately surfaced in my mind. Replace the salt after rain. I stood there staring at the washed clean ground. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part remembered the knocking at the door, the bell, the figure near cabin 3, the figure on the dock. None of those things made sense, yet they kept happening. Around 10 minutes later, I was pushing a wheelbarrow full of salt across the property. I felt ridiculous doing it. Every doorway, every cabin, every building, thin white lines. The entire process took almost an hour. While I worked, several guests watched from a distance. None of them laughed. None of them asked questions. If anything, they seemed relieved. That bothered me too. Near sunset, I finished the final doorway and headed back toward the lodge. That's when I noticed cabin 6. The front entrance looked wrong. At first, I couldn't figure out why. Then I realized part of the salt line had been disturbed, not washed away. Disturbed. There was a clear gap roughly 6 inches wide. I stared at it for several seconds. The rest of the line remained intact. Only that small section was missing. Maybe someone stepped through it. Maybe a guest accidentally kicked it aside. Logical explanations existed, yet I couldn't shake a growing feeling of unease. I grabbed another handful of salt and filled the gap. As I straightened up, the front door of cabin 6 opened. A woman in her 40s stepped outside carrying a beach towel. She looked surprised to see me. I asked whether anyone had walked through the doorway recently. She shook her head. She and her husband had spent most of the afternoon fishing. Nobody else had entered the cabin. I thanked her and returned to the lodge. That evening, I found myself checking the salt lines twice, then 3 times. I wasn't proud of it. The rules had become a habit. Around 11:30, I finished locking up. Sunset had come and gone. The dock gate was secured. Guests were inside their cabins. Everything appeared fine. Then I heard shouting. The sound came from somewhere near the shoreline. I immediately grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. 2 guests stood near the water arguing with a third man I didn't recognize. He wore dark clothing and stood just beyond the edge of the property. Even from a distance, something about him felt strange. Not threatening, just wrong. The couple kept asking if he needed help. The man didn't respond. He simply stared past them toward the lake. When my flashlight beam reached him, he slowly turned his head. For a brief moment, I saw his face. At least I think I did. Later, I struggled to remember specific details. All I could clearly recall was how pale he looked. Unnaturally pale. The couple asked another question. The man took a single step backward, then another. Then he disappeared into the trees. Just like that. Gone. The husband laughed nervously and suggested the stranger had probably been drunk. I agreed because it was the easiest explanation available. Still, my hands felt cold all the way back to the lodge. Around midnight, I made coffee even though I wasn't tired. The storm had left the air unusually still. No wind, no insects, no distant boat motors, just silence. I sat near the office window reviewing invoices. Then I noticed movement outside. A figure crossing the parking area between the cabins. I stood immediately. The figure walked slowly, almost casually. Not a guest. Too tall. Too thin. I moved closer to the window. The figure stopped. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then something occurred to me. Rule 4 didn't only warn against opening doors. It specifically warned against looking outside after certain situations. A strange memory surfaced. Turn on the lights. Avoid the windows. My stomach tightened. I stepped back from the glass. A few moments later, another sound drifted across the darkness from the direction of the lake. One clear metallic ring. The bell. Then another. Then silence. I remained where I was, staring at the floor instead of the window. Several long minutes passed. Eventually, the sensation of being watched faded. When I finally looked outside again, the parking lot was empty. The figure was gone. The following morning, I found fresh footprints near cabin 6. They began beside the broken section of salt line I had repaired. Then they continued toward the woods. There were only a few, just enough to suggest someone had crossed onto the property during the night. What bothered me was their direction. They weren't heading in. They were heading out. The footprints stayed in my head for the rest of the day. It wasn't just the fact that they existed. It was the direction. Every strange thing that had happened around the resort seemed to involve something coming in. The figure near cabin 3. The man at the end of the dock. The visitor outside the lodge after midnight. But those prints suggested the opposite. Something had already been inside the property before leaving. I crouched beside them for several minutes that morning, studying the impressions in the damp soil. They looked like ordinary boot prints. Nothing supernatural, nothing dramatic, just enough detail to tell me they belonged to someone larger than average. The trail disappeared into the woods after 30 or 40 yards. I considered following it. For a few seconds, I actually started to. Then common sense kicked in. I had guests arriving that afternoon. Cabins needed cleaning. Sheets needed changing. The practical responsibilities of running a resort didn't stop just because something strange was happening. By lunchtime, I was busy enough to push the footprints out of my mind. At least temporarily. A family from Wisconsin checked into cabin 1. A retired couple rented cabin 4. 2 brothers arrived with enough fishing equipment to supply a small sporting goods store. Normal people. Normal conversations. Normal problems. It helped. Every time I started thinking about the rules, somebody needed extra towels or directions to a grocery store. Reality kept pulling me back. Around 3 in the afternoon, Sharon stopped by with a box of maintenance supplies. Light bulbs, batteries, cleaning products, the usual things. While we unloaded everything into storage, I mentioned the footprints. Her reaction was immediate, not panic, not surprise, something closer to resignation. Like I'd just informed her that a storm was moving in. She asked where I'd found them. I told her. Then she asked whether the salt line had been broken beforehand. I nodded. Sharon stared at the floor for a few seconds. Finally, she said something that stayed with me. She said the rules existed because the resort sat on land that didn't always behave the way land was supposed to. That was it. No further explanation. I asked what that even meant. She shook her head and said my father used to say people only believed the rules after they needed them. Then she left. The conversation irritated me more than it scared me. Everyone kept talking in half answers, half warnings, half stories. Nobody would simply explain what was going on. That evening, I locked the dock gate just before sunset. The routine had become automatic by then. Check the cabins, walk the shoreline, lock the gate, inspect the salt lines, head back to the lodge. As I finished securing the latch, I noticed somebody standing farther down the shore. At first, I assumed it was one of the guests. Then I realized the figure was standing ankle deep in the water, motionless, facing the lake. The distance made identification difficult. I called out. No response. I called again. Still nothing. The figure remained perfectly still. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. The sun had nearly disappeared. Orange light stretched across the lake. Long shadows covered the shoreline. Then the bell rang. One clear metallic note drifting across the water. The figure immediately turned. Not toward me. Toward the sound. I remember seeing that movement very clearly. Slow. Deliberate. Almost mechanical. Then the figure walked farther into the lake. Not swimming. Walking. The water reached its knees, then its waist, then its chest. I started moving before I realized I was moving. Adrenaline took over. Somebody needed help. Somebody was drowning. I reached the dock entrance and grabbed the gate. The metal latch felt cold beneath my hand. Then another memory surfaced. After the gate is locked, do not go onto the lake for any reason. I froze. Every instinct told me to ignore the rule. Yet something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. The figure wasn't struggling. It wasn't waving for help. It wasn't behaving like a person entering cold water. It simply kept walking. Another bell rang from somewhere beyond the darkness. The figure vanished beneath the surface. No splash. No panic. No sound at all. Gone. I stood there breathing hard. Waiting. Expecting the person to reappear. Nothing happened. The lake became perfectly still. Eventually, I backed away from the gate and returned to the lodge. That night, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying the scene in my head. The water, the bell, the figure disappearing beneath the surface. Around 9:30, one of the fishermen from cabin 2 came into the office. His name was Mark. I'd spoken with him several times already. Nice guy. Easygoing. He looked concerned. He asked whether I'd seen his brother. I immediately felt my stomach tighten. Apparently his brother had gone for a walk around sunset and never returned. They'd planned to clean fish together before dinner. When he didn't come back, Mark assumed he'd gotten distracted. Then an hour passed. Then another. Nobody had seen him since. We searched the property together. Every cabin, every trail, every parking area. Nothing. By midnight, several guests had joined the search. Flashlights moved through the woods. Voices echoed between the trees. No sign of him. Sheriff's deputies arrived around 1 a.m. They took statements, organized search patterns, asked questions. Throughout the entire process, I never mentioned the figure entering the lake, partly because I wasn't certain it had been him, partly because I knew how insane it would sound. The search continued into the following day. Divers checked sections of shoreline. Boats scanned the water. Dogs searched nearby trails. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. By afternoon, a strange atmosphere had settled over the resort. Guests spoke quietly. Parents kept children close. Nobody lingered near the lake. The absence felt heavier than any evidence could have. Around sunset, I stood alone outside the lodge watching the water darken. The search boats had returned to shore. The deputies were gone. The lake looked exactly the same as it always had. Calm. Silent. Indifferent. Then I noticed something floating near the dock. My pulse immediately quickened. I grabbed a flashlight and walked closer. It wasn't a body. It wasn't clothing. It was a tackle box. Old. Metal. Rusted around the edges. When I opened it, I found fishing lures, tangled line, and a folded piece of paper. The paper looked ancient, yellowed with age, damp but still readable. At first, I assumed it belonged to some fisherman. Then I recognized the handwriting. It matched the note containing the 5 rules. My father's handwriting. The message contained only a single sentence. If someone follows the bell into the lake, do not look for them after sunset. You will not find who you think you are searching for. I must have read those words 10 times. The evening breeze moved across the water. Somewhere far out in the darkness, beyond the last traces of sunlight, a bell rang once. Then silence returned. I didn't tell anyone about the note. Not the deputies, not the guests, not even Sharon. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket, then stood there beside the dock long after darkness settled over the lake. Part of me knew I should have handed it over. A missing man was still missing. People were searching. Families were worried. Yet something about the message felt personal. It felt like my father had left it specifically for whoever inherited the resort after him. For me. The bell never rang again that night. I kept waiting for it, listening for it. Around midnight, I finally went back inside and locked the lodge. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the figure walking into the lake. Not swimming. Walking. Like the water wasn't really water at all. The next morning brought fog. Thick fog. The kind that hangs low over the shoreline and swallows everything beyond a few dozen yards. From the porch, I could barely see the first section of the dock. The rest disappeared into white haze. Most guests stayed inside longer than usual. Coffee makers hummed. Television sets murmured through cabin walls. The entire resort felt subdued after the disappearance. Around 10 o'clock, Sharon arrived. She took one look at me and immediately asked whether I'd slept. I told her not much. She nodded as if she'd expected that answer. Then she asked whether I'd found anything unusual near the lake. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, just for a second, apparently long enough for her to notice. Sharon studied me quietly. Then she sighed and sat down on the porch bench. For the first time since I'd arrived at Lake Serenity, she seemed tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired, like somebody carrying the same burden for too many years. After a long silence, she asked whether my father ever told me why he left. I said no, because he never had. She looked out toward the fog. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. My father hadn't always followed the rules. Years ago, he broke one. She didn't say which one. Only that afterward, he spent the rest of his life making sure nobody else repeated the mistake. Before I could ask more questions, she stood up and changed the subject. Again, I was starting to think everyone in this town attended the same school for avoiding direct answers. The fog lingered most of the day. By late afternoon, visibility remained poor. I completed my usual routine, checking cabins, inspecting salt lines, preparing reservation paperwork. Everything seemed normal until shortly before sunset. That's when I noticed something strange near the shoreline. At first, I thought it was another person standing in the fog. Then I realized it wasn't moving. Curious, I walked closer. The shape gradually emerged from the mist. A rowboat. An old wooden rowboat resting half on shore, half in the water. I'd never seen it before. The paint was faded almost beyond recognition. Moss clung to the sides. Water filled the bottom. Judging by its condition, it looked like it had been sitting abandoned for decades. Yet somehow it hadn't been there that morning. I would have noticed. The boat sat less than 50 yards from the dock. I approached cautiously. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. Not dangerous. Just out of place. Like finding a forgotten photograph inside a brand new wallet. Inside the boat lay several fishing lures, a rusted lantern, and a wooden tackle box identical to the one I'd found the previous evening. My pulse quickened immediately. I stepped closer. The tackle box lid hung partially open. Inside rested another folded note. Same paper. Same handwriting. My father's. I unfolded it carefully. This note contained only one sentence. If the fog stays after sunset, stay away from the shoreline until morning. I stared at the words for several seconds. Then I looked back toward the lake. The fog remained thick. Unnaturally thick, now that I thought about it. Sunset was only 15 minutes away. Rationally, I knew I should have laughed. Yet by that point I'd already seen too many things I couldn't explain. I folded the note and headed back toward the lodge. The moment the sun disappeared beyond the trees, something changed. The fog seemed denser, not dramatically, just enough that distant shapes became impossible to identify. Cabin lights glowed like faint stars through the mist. The lake vanished completely. Around 8 o'clock, a guest knocked on the office door. An older woman staying in cabin 4. She looked nervous. She asked whether somebody had been walking around outside her cabin. I asked what she meant. She said she'd seen a person standing near the tree line about 20 minutes earlier. When she looked again, the figure was gone. I asked for a description. She struggled to provide one. Tall, thin, male maybe. She wasn't sure. The uncertainty sounded familiar. Too familiar. I reassured her as best I could and offered to check the area. She thanked me and returned to her cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The fog immediately swallowed most of the beam. Trees appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Every sound seemed muffled. My boots crunched softly on gravel as I walked between cabins. No sign of anyone. I searched for nearly 20 minutes. Nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Somewhere ahead. Slow. Measured. Crunch. 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 I stopped moving. The footsteps continued for 3 more steps. Then silence. My flashlight swept across the fog. Empty. Trees. Grass. Nothing else. I called out. No answer. A few seconds later, the footsteps resumed. This time farther away, moving toward the lake. My stomach tightened. Every instinct told me to follow. Every memory of the rules told me not to. The footsteps continued. Slow, steady, leading somewhere beyond visibility. Then the bell rang. One clear metallic note emerging from the darkness. The footsteps stopped immediately. Silence returned. Complete silence. Even the wind seemed absent. I stood there listening. Waiting. Then another sound reached me. Breathing. Close. Much closer than the footsteps had been. I spun around. My flashlight beam cut through the fog behind me. For a fraction of a second, I saw somebody standing less than 10 feet away. Tall. Motionless. Pale. Then the fog shifted and the figure vanished. I don't mean it ran away. I don't mean it stepped behind a tree. It simply wasn't there anymore. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. That was enough for me. I turned and headed directly back toward the lodge. I walked fast. Not running. Just fast. The entire way I had the distinct feeling something was following behind me. Not attacking. Not rushing. Just matching my pace somewhere within the fog. When I finally reached the porch, the sensation disappeared instantly. The rest of the night passed without incident. No knocking. No bell. No strange visitors. Yet the following morning brought something far worse. The fog had finally lifted. The lake looked normal again. Calm. Peaceful. Ordinary. Then I noticed something near the dock. Another boat. Not the old rowboat from the shoreline. This one floated quietly beside the locked gate. Empty. Drifting gently against the wood. One of the deputies arrived an hour later and identified it immediately. It belonged to the missing fisherman. His brother. The man who vanished after sunset. The boat had disappeared with him 3 nights earlier. Now it had somehow returned by itself. Inside the boat sat a single object. A rusted brass bell covered in lake water and weeds. The deputy lifted the bell carefully using the sleeve of his jacket. At first glance it looked ordinary. Old brass. Corroded from years underwater. Yet the moment I saw it, a cold sensation settled in my stomach. Because I recognized it. Not the specific bell itself, but the shape. The size. The design. It looked exactly like the bell I kept hearing at night. Rationally, I knew that made no sense. Sound travels strangely across lakes. Memory plays tricks. Fear fills in gaps. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The deputy asked whether I'd seen it before. I lied and said no. He placed it into an evidence bag and carried it away. The missing fisherman was officially considered a search and rescue case, though by then everyone knew what that really meant. The brother left the resort the following afternoon. Before he drove away, he stopped by the office. He looked exhausted, older than he had a week earlier. He thanked me for everything and apologized for bringing trouble to the resort. I told him none of it was his fault. He nodded. Then he hesitated, just for a second. Finally, he asked whether I'd ever heard anything strange coming from the lake after dark. My heart skipped. I asked what he meant. He stared past me toward the water. Then he said his brother had mentioned hearing a bell 2 nights before he disappeared. After that, he climbed into his truck and left. The conversation stayed with me all day. By evening, I found myself digging through old storage rooms in the lodge. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. Information. Maybe answers. Something my father had left behind besides a list of rules and cryptic notes. Most of the storage areas contained exactly what you'd expect. Old reservation forms, broken furniture, fishing equipment, maintenance records, dust. Lots of dust. Near the back of a closet beneath a stack of outdated brochures, I found a cardboard box sealed with yellowed tape. My father's handwriting covered one side. It simply read personal. I carried it into the office and spent nearly an hour sorting through the contents. Photographs mostly. Fishing trips, resort repairs, holiday gatherings. There were pictures of guests I didn't recognize standing beside fish nearly as large as they were. Pictures of cabins under construction. Pictures of my father when he was younger, happier. Then I found something unusual. A photograph of the dock. Nothing strange about that, except the dock looked different. Shorter. Older. And at the very end stood a small structure I had never seen before. It resembled a covered platform or shelter. The date written on the back read September 1998. I immediately went outside and stared toward the current dock. No structure existed there now, just open boards stretching across the water. Confused, I returned to the box. More photographs followed. Several showed the same structure. Then abruptly it vanished from later pictures, as if it had been removed. Tucked beneath the photographs sat a thin notebook. Not a journal exactly, more like maintenance records. Most entries discussed repairs, boat rentals, weather damage. Then the writing changed. Shorter notes, personal observations. I spent hours reading them. The earliest entries sounded skeptical. My father clearly hadn't believed the stories surrounding the lake. Then gradually his tone shifted. One entry described hearing the bell. Another mentioned finding wet footprints inside a locked cabin. Another described seeing someone standing at the end of the dock after sunset. The handwriting became messier over time, more urgent. One entry stopped me completely. The old shelter at the end of the dock was removed because people kept going there after hearing the bell. It made them easier to reach. I read the sentence 3 times. Easier to reach. Reach from where? Reach by what? No explanation followed. The next several pages had been torn out. That bothered me more than anything I'd read. Someone had deliberately removed them. Maybe my father, maybe somebody else. I sat in the office long after midnight turning pages. Most later entries focused on the rules, reinforcing them, updating them, recording incidents. One line appeared repeatedly throughout the notebook. Never look twice. I had no idea what it meant. Around 1 in the morning, I finally closed the notebook and stood up. That's when I noticed movement outside the office window. My pulse jumped immediately. The parking lot beyond the glass sat mostly empty. Yet for a split second, I was certain someone had just walked past. I stepped closer. Nothing. Darkness. Cabin lights glowing in the distance. Then a knock echoed through the lodge. One knock, soft, from the front door. I froze. Every muscle tightened instantly. Another knock followed. Slow. Patient. The exact same rhythm from weeks earlier. Tap. Pause. Tap. Pause. Tap. I looked at the clock. 112 amperes. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring toward the entrance. The knocking continued. Not louder. Not faster. Just steady. Familiar. My father's notebook rested on the desk beside me. I found myself staring at it. Then at the door. Then back at the notebook. Another knock. Then a voice. Male. Calm. Friendly. Asking for help. The words sounded different this time, but the tone was identical. Too identical. Like listening to a recording played through different speakers. I backed away from the door immediately. No hesitation. No debate. I already knew better. The knocking continued. Minutes passed. 5. 7. 9. Then I remembered the rule. If the knocking continues for more than 10 minutes, turn on every light and avoid the windows. I moved quickly through the lodge, flipping switches. Hallways brightened. Lamps illuminated corners. Reflections appeared across the glass. The knocking stopped instantly, not gradually. Instantly. The silence that followed felt unnatural. Heavy, like the entire building was holding its breath. I returned to the office and deliberately avoided the windows. Another minute passed, then 2. Eventually, curiosity started creeping back in. Human curiosity, the stupid kind, the dangerous kind. I told myself I only wanted to confirm the parking lot was empty. That's all, just a quick glance. I stepped toward the nearest window, then stopped. The phrase from my father's notebook surfaced in my mind. Never look twice, I frowned. What did that even mean? A memory suddenly clicked into place. The figure on the dock, the pale man in the fog, the stranger near cabin 3. Every time I saw them, I looked away for a second. When I looked back, they were gone. Never looked twice. Slowly, very slowly, I turned toward the window. I looked once. The parking lot appeared empty. Then movement caught my eye near cabin 6. A tall figure standing beside the tree line. Pale. Motionless. Watching the lodge. My breath caught. Instinct immediately urged me to blink, to look away, to check again. Instead, I forced myself to keep staring. Seconds passed. The figure remained exactly where it was. Then something strange happened. The longer I looked, the less human it appeared. Its proportions seemed wrong. Arms too long, neck too thin, face indistinct, almost unfinished. A wave of nausea rolled through me. Without thinking, I looked away. Just for a second. Then I looked back. The tree line was empty. The figure had vanished. My heart hammered against my ribs. Suddenly, I understood why my father had written the phrase so many times. Not because looking twice made the thing disappear. Because looking twice meant giving it a chance to move. Outside, beyond the trees, somewhere across the dark water, a bell rang once. Then another. Then another. For the first time since arriving at Lake Serenity, the sound didn't seem distant anymore. It sounded closer, much closer, as if whatever had been waiting out on the lake was slowly making its way toward shore. The bell continued ringing long after I stopped seeing the figure near the tree line. Not constantly. Not in any predictable pattern. One distant chime would drift across the lake, then silence would return for several minutes, before another followed. By 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely. I sat behind the office desk drinking stale coffee and rereading my father's notebook. The more I read, the more I noticed something strange. Most of the entries weren't descriptions of what happened when people followed the rules. They were descriptions of what happened when they didn't. A guest opening a cabin door after midnight. A fisherman staying on the water after sunset. Someone crossing a broken salt line without repairing it. The details were frustratingly incomplete. Names rarely appeared. Dates were missing from many pages. Yet a pattern slowly emerged. The lake never seemed interested in everyone. Only certain people. People who heard the bell. People who noticed the figures. People who looked too long, or looked twice. Around dawn, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I fell asleep in the office chair and woke 2 hours later with a stiff neck and sunlight pouring through the windows. The morning itself felt normal, almost aggressively normal. Families checked out. Children ran across the grass. Someone grilled bacon outside cabin 2. The contrast made everything from the previous night feel ridiculous, like a bad dream clinging to reality longer than it should. Then Sharon arrived. I showed her the notebook. Not all of it. Just enough to convince her I'd found my father's records. Her expression darkened immediately. She flipped through several pages before stopping at one particular entry. I watched her face carefully. She recognized it. Whatever she was reading wasn't new information. Finally, she closed the notebook and handed it back. I asked her directly what my father had done years ago, the mistake she mentioned. For once, she didn't dodge the question. She stared out toward the lake and took a long breath. Then she told me he had gone looking for someone after sunset. A missing guest. A teenager who disappeared near the shoreline during the late 90s. My father organized a search despite repeated warnings from local residents. According to Sharon, he followed voices into the fog. He returned before dawn. Alive. Physically unharmed, but different. She couldn't explain how. Nobody ever could. After that night, he became obsessed with the rules. Obsessed with preventing others from making the same mistake. I asked whether they found the missing teenager. Sharon remained silent for several seconds. Then she quietly said no. That answer bothered me more than anything else she had said. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventful. Yet by evening, a strange tension hung over the resort. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the accumulation of everything that had happened. Maybe it was simply exhaustion. Either way, I found myself checking the shoreline repeatedly as sunset approached. The water looked calm. Too calm. Not a single boat remained on the lake. Most guests had already retreated indoors. Even the birds seemed absent. As the last sunlight touched the horizon, I locked the dock gate. The familiar metallic click echoed through the quiet air. Then I noticed something floating near the far side of the dock. At first I assumed it was driftwood. A branch. Debris. Then it moved. Slowly. Deliberately. My pulse immediately accelerated. The object floated just beneath the surface. Pale. Human-shaped. I stepped closer despite myself. The water rippled gently around it. For several seconds I couldn't tell what I was seeing. Then the shape rolled slightly. A face emerged. Not fully, just enough. Pale skin beneath dark water. Closed eyes. Motionless features. I stumbled backward instinctively. Every rational thought vanished. The thing floating beneath the surface looked exactly like the missing fisherman. Before I could process what I was seeing, the bell rang. Loud. Closer than ever before. The sound seemed to come directly from beneath the water. The floating figure immediately sank. No struggle. No movement. 1 second visible. The next swallowed by darkness. I stood frozen at the edge of the dock. The bell rang again. Then again, each chime sounding nearer than the last. A terrible realization slowly formed in my mind. The sound wasn't approaching from somewhere across the lake anymore. It was moving beneath it, toward shore. I left immediately. That night the weather changed. Heavy clouds rolled overhead shortly after dark. Wind rattled cabin walls. Rain began around 10 o'clock. Not a storm, just steady rain. Enough to wash away every salt line on the property. I remembered Rule 1 immediately. Replace the salt after rain ends. Normally I would have waited until morning. Yet something about that night felt wrong. Deeply wrong. Around 11:30 the rain finally stopped. I grabbed a flashlight, several bags of salt, and headed outside. The property looked completely different beneath the cloud-covered sky. Darkness pooled between cabins. Water dripped from rooftops. The air smelled of wet pine and lake water. I worked quickly. Cabin 1, Cabin 2, Cabin 3. Thin white circles restored around each doorway. By the time I reached Cabin 6, my nerves were already stretched thin. That's when I noticed the door standing slightly open. My stomach tightened immediately. Cabin 6 was vacant. Nobody had rented it in days. Yet the front door now hung several inches ajar. I approached slowly, flashlight raised. Rainwater glistened across the porch boards. Everything remained silent. No movement. No voices. Just distant wind moving through trees. I pushed the door open. The cabin interior sat dark and empty. Furniture untouched. Beds neatly made. Yet something felt wrong. Then I saw it. Wet footprints. Human footprints leading across the floor. Not entering. Leaving. The trail began near the back window and continued toward the front door. I followed them with my flashlight. Each print shimmered with fresh lake water. My mouth suddenly felt dry. The prints exited the cabin and disappeared into the darkness beyond the porch. For several seconds I simply stood there staring. Then a sound reached me from somewhere nearby. A door closing. Soft. Deliberate. I turned immediately. Another cabin stood 50 yards away through the trees. Cabin 3. A faint porch light illuminated part of the structure. For a brief moment I thought I saw movement near the entrance. Then darkness swallowed it. Every instinct told me to return to the lodge, to ignore whatever was happening. Instead, I found myself walking toward Cabin 3. Slowly. Carefully. The wet ground muffled my footsteps. My flashlight beam swept across trees and grass. Nothing. No footprints. No people. Yet the feeling of being watched returned stronger than ever. Halfway there, I noticed something strange near the lake. Reflected light, not moonlight, not cabin lights, something else. A pale glow moving across the water's surface. I stopped immediately. Rule 5 surfaced in my memory. If the lake reflects something that does not exist in reality, stay inside until dawn. My eyes drifted toward the shoreline. The reflection remained visible. Long pale shapes moving across black water. The problem was there was nothing above them to create the reflection. Nothing at all. My pulse hammered against my ribs. Slowly I backed away from the shoreline. The reflection continued moving. Silent. Wrong. Impossible. Then one of the shapes appeared to stand up from the water itself. I didn't wait to confirm what I had seen. I turned and hurried back toward the lodge. Not running. Not yet. Just moving as quickly as I could without losing control. Behind me the bell rang once, then twice, then a third time. Much closer than it had ever been before. By the time I reached the porch, I was breathing hard. I locked the door behind me, closed every curtain, turned off every light facing the lake, exactly as Rule 5 instructed. For the remainder of the night, I stayed inside the office, holding my father's notebook. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside the building. Slow footsteps circling the lodge. Then came the sound of wet hands sliding across windows. Not scratching, not pounding, just dragging slowly across glass. The footsteps continued until dawn. The footsteps stopped the moment sunlight touched the windows. Not gradually, not fading into the distance. 1 second they were circling the lodge. The next there was nothing. Complete silence. I remained in the office chair for another 20 minutes before finally standing up. My back ached. My eyes burned from exhaustion. The coffee beside me had gone cold hours earlier. For most of the night I hadn't moved. I just sat there listening. Listening to footsteps. Listening to wet hands sliding across glass. Listening to something moving around the building, while I desperately tried not to imagine what it might look like if I opened the curtains. When dawn finally arrived, I walked through the lodge and checked every window. Long streaks of dried lake water covered the outside glass. Some reached nearly 7 feet high. Others appeared lower, as though several different people had been touching the windows throughout the night. My stomach tightened immediately. I stepped outside. The air felt colder than it should have. Fresh mud surrounded portions of the lodge. More footprints, dozens of them. Human footprints, bare feet, large and small. They covered sections of the property near the shoreline and continued towards several cabins before abruptly disappearing. The sight made my skin crawl. I crouched beside one of the prints and studied it. It looked normal. Too normal. 5 toes, human proportions. Nothing monstrous. Yet something about seeing so many of them at once felt deeply wrong. As though a crowd had wandered through the resort while everyone slept. Around 9 o'clock Sharon arrived. The moment she saw the footprints, all color drained from her face. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She already knew what they meant. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she asked whether I'd stayed inside after seeing the reflection on the lake. I nodded. She looked relieved, genuinely relieved. Then she told me something I had never heard before. According to local stories, the reflections were the final warning. Not the beginning. The final warning. Whatever lived in the lake could only approach so far on its own. After that, it needed help. It needed people making mistakes, breaking rules, following voices, opening doors, looking twice. I asked what exactly lived in the lake. Sharon simply shook her head. Then she said something far worse. She said nobody knew anymore. The original stories were older than the town itself, older than the resort, older than the roads surrounding the lake. Whatever explanation once existed had been lost generations ago. Only the rules remained. The rest of the day passed beneath an atmosphere of quiet tension. Guests noticed something felt wrong. Even those who knew nothing about the rules seemed uneasy. Several families checked out early. Others avoided the shoreline entirely. By afternoon, only a handful of cabins remained occupied. I spent most of the day reading through every remaining page of my father's notebook. Hidden among maintenance records and scattered observations, I eventually found what looked like the final entry he ever wrote. The handwriting appeared shaky, uneven, much older than the previous notes. It read, "If the bell reaches shore, the rules will stop being enough. After that, Someone must finish what was started at the dock. That was all. No explanation. No details. No indication what he meant, just a single sentence. I stared at it for nearly an hour. Finish what was started at the dock. The phrase kept repeating in my head. Eventually, I returned to the old photograph showing the structure that once stood at the end of the dock. The shelter removed decades earlier. Suddenly, I realized something. My father never wrote that the structure was destroyed, only removed. That evening, I began searching storage buildings around the property. The sun slowly descended behind the trees, while I moved through sheds and maintenance garages. Most contained junk accumulated over decades: broken motors, rusted tools, rotting furniture. Nothing useful. Then, shortly before sunset, I found it, hidden beneath tarps inside an old boathouse near the western shoreline. Weathered wooden beams, sections of railing, pieces of roofing material, the remains of the structure from the photograph. My pulse accelerated immediately. I spent nearly an hour examining everything. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed markings carved into several boards. Not words. Symbols. Repeating patterns worn smooth by time. Near the base of one support beam, I found a metal box bolted to the wood. The lock had rusted away years earlier. Inside sat several old photographs and a folded map of the lake. My father had covered portions of the map with handwritten notes. Most were impossible to read. Water damage had erased them. One marking remained visible. A circle drawn near the deepest part of the lake. Next to it, my father had written a short sentence. "That is where the bell comes from." I stared at the words for a long time. Then I noticed another note farther down the map. "If it ever returns to shore, take it back before the next new moon. Otherwise, it will keep bringing them closer." Them. Not it. Them. My heart immediately started pounding. The brass bell recovered from the fisherman's boat had returned to shore. The deputies still had it. Suddenly, everything felt connected. The footprints, the visitors, the reflections, the increasing frequency of the bell itself. Night arrived before I finished processing the realization. Dark clouds gathered overhead once again. Wind moved through the trees. Somewhere across the lake, a loon cried out before falling silent. I called Sharon immediately. She answered on the second ring. I explained everything. The map, the notes, the bell. For several seconds, she remained silent. Then she told me something she had apparently been avoiding for weeks. My father hadn't inherited the resort. He had volunteered for it. Years earlier, another owner disappeared. The locals believed someone needed to remain there. Someone willing to maintain the rules and keep watch over the lake. Eventually, my father became that person. Now, without realizing it, I had inherited more than property. I had inherited responsibility. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Neither of us knew what to do next. Around 11 o'clock, a storm rolled across the lake. Thunder echoed through the darkness. Rain hammered rooftops. Lightning illuminated the shoreline in brief flashes of white. I sat alone inside the office studying the map. Then the power failed. Everything went dark instantly. The lodge fell silent except for rain striking windows. My flashlight sat inside a desk drawer. I reached for it immediately. The beam cut through darkness, just as another flash of lightning illuminated the room. For a split second, I saw something standing outside the office window. Tall, pale, motionless. Then darkness returned. My heart nearly stopped. I froze. Another lightning flash followed several seconds later. The figure remained there, watching, not moving. Rain streamed down the glass between us. I remembered Rule 4, avoid the windows. Yet by then the thing had already seen me. Another flash. This time there were two figures, one beside the other, both standing perfectly still. My mouth went dry. Another flash. 4 figures now, spread across the parking lot. Pale faces, dark silhouettes, motionless beneath heavy rain. The next flash revealed even more. A dozen at least, maybe 20, standing among cabins, near trees, beside vehicles, every single one facing the lodge. The sight triggered something primal deep inside me, the kind of fear that bypasses logic entirely. Then the bell rang, loud, not from the lake, not from far away, directly outside the building. One powerful metallic chime. Every figure simultaneously took a single step forward. Then the power came back. Lights flooded the office. The parking lot instantly became empty. No figures. No movement. Nothing. Only rain, yet I knew what I had seen. More importantly, I knew something else. Whatever was happening was no longer confined to the lake. It had reached the resort itself, and somewhere beyond the storm, beyond the shoreline, beyond the darkness covering the water, something was waiting for the bell to ring again. I didn't sleep at all that night. There wasn't any point trying. Every time thunder rolled across the lake, I found myself looking toward the windows despite knowing better. Every time lightning flashed, I expected to see those figures again. Pale faces standing motionless between the cabins, watching, waiting. The storm finally weakened sometime before dawn. Rain softened into a steady drizzle. Wind faded. Eventually, only the sound of water dripping from rooftops remained. Around 5 in the morning, I sat alone in the office with my father's notebook, the map, and the photograph of the old dock shelter spread across the desk. For the first time since arriving at Lake Serenity, I felt like the pieces were finally beginning to fit together. Not completely. Not enough to explain everything, but enough to understand what my father had spent decades trying to prevent. The bell wasn't simply a warning. It was a door, or maybe a beacon. Something that connected the lake to whatever waited beyond it. Every broken rule seemed to bring that connection closer to shore. The footprints, the visitors, the reflections, the figures appearing farther inland each time. The process wasn't random. It was escalating. And according to the map, the bell needed to be returned before the next new moon. I checked my phone. 3 days remained. 3 days. That was all. By mid-morning, I had driven into town and found Sharon waiting outside the diner. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept much either. I showed her the map, the photograph, the final notebook entries. She studied everything carefully before finally nodding. Then she told me the one thing nobody had mentioned until then. The bell hadn't always been at the bottom of the lake. According to local stories, it originally hung inside the shelter at the end of the dock. Nobody knew who placed it there. Nobody knew how old it was. Eventually, people realized the bell attracted attention. Not from tourists, not from fishermen, from something else. The shelter had been built around it, then later removed. Finally, the bell itself had somehow ended up beneath the lake decades earlier. My father believed that was intentional. I asked the obvious question. If the bell was the problem, why not destroy it? Sharon's expression immediately changed. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. Then she quietly said several people had tried. None of them succeeded. The conversation ended there. By afternoon, we had reached a decision. Whether it made sense or not, the bell needed to go back where it came from, back to the deepest part of the lake marked on my father's map. Neither of us had a better idea. The deputies still possessed the recovered bell. Convincing them to release evidence from an active investigation proved impossible. Fortunately, nature intervened. That evening, one of the deputies contacted me. The bell had disappeared, vanished from a locked evidence room sometime during the previous night. No signs of forced entry. No explanation. The deputy sounded embarrassed. I pretended to be surprised. I wasn't. Around sunset, I found the bell sitting at the end of the dock, exactly where the old shelter once stood, resting on weathered boards covered in lake water. Waiting. The sight should have terrified me. Instead, it felt inevitable. Like a story reaching its final chapter, the bell appeared older than I remembered, darker somehow. Water dripped steadily from its surface despite sitting in open air. I didn't touch it immediately. I simply stood there staring. Then the bell moved slightly. Not much. Just enough to produce a faint metallic sound. My pulse accelerated. Somewhere across the lake another bell answered. Then another. The echoes drifted through the darkness like distant conversations. That was when I knew we had run out of time. Night arrived quickly. Clouds covered the stars. The resort sat almost completely empty now. Most guests had left days earlier. Only silence remained. Sharon arrived shortly after dark carrying a lantern and an expression I will never forget. Fear. Real fear. Not uncertainty. Not anxiety. Fear. We loaded supplies into one of the remaining boats. Flashlights. Rope. Life jackets. The map. Neither of us spoke much. There wasn't anything left to say. Around 10 o'clock, we pushed away from shore. The lake swallowed the sound almost immediately. The resort lights gradually shrank behind us. Darkness surrounded everything. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds came from water striking the hull and the distant ringing of bells somewhere ahead. Not one bell anymore. Several. Different tones. Different distances. Some close. Some impossibly far away. The deeper we moved into the lake, the more wrong everything felt. The air seemed colder, thicker. Even the darkness looked different. Eventually, we reached the location marked on my father's map. According to the GPS, we floated directly above the deepest section of the lake. More than 200 feet below us. The bells stopped. Complete silence followed. I looked toward Sharon. She looked back. Neither of us wanted to be the first person to move. Then the water changed. At first, I thought it was a trick of moonlight. Except there was no moon. The surface beneath us had become reflective. Perfectly reflective. Like polished black glass. My stomach tightened immediately. Rule 5. If the lake reflects something that does not exist in reality, stay inside until dawn. Unfortunately, we weren't inside. And when I looked down, I understood why the rule existed. The reflection wasn't showing the night sky. It wasn't showing our boat. It wasn't showing reality at all. Beneath us stood the old shelter from the photographs. Perfectly intact. Illuminated by pale lantern light. The bell hanging beneath its roof. People stood around it. Dozens of them. Motionless. Watching upward. Watching us. Some wore modern clothing. Others looked decades out of date. Then I recognized one face. The missing fisherman. Standing among them. Motionless. Pale. My breath caught. Sharon whispered something under her breath. A prayer, maybe. I don't know. Then another face became visible. My father, standing beside the shelter, looking directly at me. Every rational part of my brain screamed that it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Yet I couldn't look away. The reflection shifted. The figures began moving, not toward us, toward the bell. One by one they gathered around it, waiting, expecting something. Then the bell hanging from our boat rolled across the floorboards by itself. Slowly, deliberately, it stopped at my feet. A realization settled over me. Heavy. Certain. My father hadn't spent years protecting the resort because he wanted to. He stayed because someone always had to. Someone had to keep the rules. Someone had to watch the lake. Someone had to prevent whatever waited below from reaching shore. The responsibility never disappeared. It simply passed to the next person. I picked up the bell. The metal felt ice cold. Instantly, the reflection beneath us began changing. The figures looked upward. Every single one, including my father. Then, for the briefest moment, he nodded. Not a ghost. Not a vision. Maybe just my exhausted mind searching for meaning. It didn't matter. I understood what needed to happen. Without giving myself time to reconsider, I tied the rope around the bell and lowered it into the water. The descent seemed endless. 20 feet. 40. 60. The rope continued sinking. Eventually it went slack. The bell had reached something. Then every bell across the lake rang at once. The sound exploded through the darkness. Water erupted around the boat. The reflection shattered instantly. Waves slammed against the hull. The rope tore from my hands and vanished below. For several terrifying seconds, I thought the lake intended to drag us down with it. Then everything stopped. The bells fell silent. The water calmed. The darkness remained. Nothing else. Just a lake. Ordinary. Silent. Empty. Sharon and I sat there for a long time afterward. Neither of us speaking. Neither of us moving. Eventually, we returned to shore. Dawn arrived an hour later. The first sunlight touched the resort. Birds returned. Wind moved through trees. Everything looked normal again. That was 2 years ago. Since then, no guests have disappeared. No figures have appeared outside windows. No reflections have shown impossible things. The bell has never been heard again, at least not by anyone who told me about it. The rules still exist. I keep them framed inside the office. Every doorway still receives salt before sunset. The dock gate still gets locked every evening. I still refuse to answer doors after midnight. Maybe the danger is gone. Maybe it isn't. The truth is, I don't know. What I do know is this. Last month, I found a new entry inside my father's notebook. An entry that definitely wasn't there before. Same handwriting. Same aging ink. Only one sentence. The lake is quiet again. Keep it that way. And every evening when the sun touches the horizon, I still lock the dock gate and look out across the water, just to make sure nothing is coming back. If you've made it this far, thank you for coming along with me through the story of Lake Serenity. Even now, I still don't know exactly what was lying beneath that lake. Maybe I don't want to know. Some secrets are better left buried beneath cold water and forgotten. But this isn't the end. There are still plenty of strange places out there, plenty of strange jobs, and plenty of rules that should never have existed in the first place. If you enjoy stories like this one, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And before you go, let me know down in the comments. What would you do if you suddenly inherited a place like Lake Serenity? I'll see you in the next story.